As the Secretary General, I mean, you are the man who is most aligned with global leadership, with multilateralism. And so I have to say, from my perspective right now, when I look at climate change, when I look at the response to the pandemic, when I look at Afghanistan, it doesn't feel great right now. The trajectory feels pretty bad on all of those issues. How do you respond to that in your position?
Well, we are facing a number of dramatic challenges. A virus is defeating us as an international community. Climate change, we are far from the consensus that is needed between developed and developing countries to really be able to get to net zero in 2050. And at the same time, we see this multiplication of crises all over the world. We are going in the wrong direction in all these aspects. We see a geopolitical divide that is becoming deeper and deeper. The geopolitical divide today is such that in crucial areas like vaccine equity or climate action, we do not see the international community united, especially because the big powers are not united. The big powers are deeply divided. And this is a dramatic situation. Now, look at COVID. I mean, in my country, 80% of the population is vaccinated. Many African countries have 2% of the population vaccinated. We see mutations all the time. We see variants all the time. Now they speak about variants that might be able to be immune to vaccines. So as the COVID is spreading like wildfire in the developing countries, we risk to make the vaccines that are essentially available to developed countries useless. This is a suicide. I mean, look at climate. When we've seen what happened in Germany, when we've seen what happened in Canada with the heat waves, when we see what's happening with the glaciers in Greenland and the high level and the level of the seas rising, when we see Antarctica being put into question. I mean, it is clear that we are facing a disaster in climate change. But at the present moment, there is a lack of trust between developed countries and developing countries, especially emerging economies. It is clear emerging economies need to be more, namely on coal, but it is clear developed countries must abide by the commitments they made in Paris, namely to mobilize $100 billion in support to developing countries, both to reduce emissions and to support their population in resilience, in building better infrastructure, being able to resist to these horrible events that climate change is creating. Now, we need to rebuild trust between developed countries and developing countries if we want to rescue COP26. And the worst thing that could happen to us is this mistrust going on, the developed countries not being able to meet their commitments, developing countries, especially emerging economies, not being able to reduce emissions as much as needed, and we will get, in some aspects, to tipping points.
So what
and
happened?
Then it's irreversible.
What happened? I mean, talking specifically about COP26, and your first term as Secretary General has been at least as much about climate as anything else. Biden becomes president. For the first time ever, John Kerry, a cabinet appointee for climate change, he knows the issue, he has the network. The US rejoins Paris Climate Accord. And yet right now, everything I hear is that COP26 is actually set up to fail. What happened?
There was a time in which the fact the United States was engaged in an important international issue, that would mean that issue could be solved. The fact the US was engaged on an issue would mean that the whole world would become engaged on that issue. We are no longer in that situation. Today, no issue can be solved without the United States. And so without the United States on climate action, we were doomed. But the fact the United States are on climate action is not enough. Because today, the largest emitter is not the United States, it's China. And today, the emerging economies represent a very large percentage. And the emerging economies, of course, can blame the developed countries, saying, well, you have been polluting for decades and decades, and now you want us to do an extra effort. And they need to do that extra effort. But to do that extra effort, developed countries must show that they also will do what they were supposed to do, namely in financial and technical support to developing countries. And what we see now is this lack of capacity for a dialogue, to come together and to understand that each one needs to give something. And everybody, it's like the chicken and the egg. Now everybody is waiting for the other side. I've been telling our English friends that preside the COP, we need to bring together the G7 on one side, Brazil, China, India, South Africa on the other side, and create a situation in which both understand that we are in a very, very dangerous situation. Because there are some tipping points we are very close to reach, which means a little bit more time and 1.5 degrees will not be a possibility as maximum increase in the amount of temperature, which means we are on the verge of the abyss. And one thing, it is clear, if you are on the verge of an abyss, you must be careful about your next step. And if COP26 does not become a success, if we are not able to cope with this challenge and finally bring the countries together, I mean, we need to make these countries understand this is the moment for an historical compromise. And whatever divisions they have, whatever geostrategic problems they have, whatever completely different visions they have on human rights, the question is, it is the survival of humanity, it is the survival of the planet, and we need to come together.
For right now, when we talk about climate and the COP26, is it fundamentally a US-China breakdown that's causing the problem?
No, it's a developed world versus developing and in particular emerging economies. Because emerging economies are already too important to be neglected. We need them also to make an extra effort, but for that extra effort to be possible, we must have a lot of support from the developed world. Coal, for instance. I've been advocating for no more coal power plants and for the phase out of coal until 2030 for OECD countries, until 2040 for all the other countries. But it's true that several economies are completely dependent on coal. And we need to help them create a transition. And for that, they need financial and technical support. Countries like Indonesia, like Vietnam, not to mention China and India themselves. I mean, so we need to have a kind of a global alliance to solve the coal problem, in which everybody needs to contribute. But we are not yet there. We need to raise the alarm because world leaders need to wake up. And as you know, it is possible to sleepwalk into a conflict, and it is possible to sleepwalk into a disaster in climate.